Summer, 1943. Over the dark skies of northern Germany, the night air trembled with the distant rumble of engines, hundreds of them, growing closer with every passing second. Inside, dimly lit control rooms scattered across the Reich, Luftwaffe radar operators hunched over their screens, watching the phosphorescent blips multiply like a spreading contagion. These were American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, forging deep into the heart of German territory. But something was wrong. The operators adjusted their equipment, tapped their screens, recalibrated frequencies. The blips were multiplying impossibly, fragmenting into thousands of false echoes. Radio channels that once carried crisp commands now hissed with deafening static. Fighter pilots screamed into their microphones, but their words dissolved into waves of electronic noise. Ground controllers shouted vectors that never reached their intended recipients. In Berlin, Luftwaffe commanders who had spent years dismissing Allied radar technology as primitive and overrated now faced an invisible enemy more devastating than any bomb, one that turned their own communication systems into instruments of chaos. The arrogance had been absolute. German generals, flush with early victories across Europe, had watched the British erect strange steel towers along their coastlines and laughed. They called them radio lighthouses and dismissed them as desperate measures from a nation on the brink of collapse. When intelligence reports confirmed these structures were indeed radar stations, capable of detecting aircraft dozens of miles away, the mockery only intensified. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring himself declared that machines could never replace the instinct and courage of German pilots. His commanders nodded in agreement, secure in their belief that the Luftwaffe's tactical brilliance and combat experience would always trump whatever technological tricks the Allies might deploy. They had seen their Stukas and Messerschmitts dominate the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. What could a few towers and radio waves possibly do against such proven might? If stories like this captivate you, consider subscribing and tell us where you're watching from. It really helps us bring more stories like this your way. But beneath the bluster and dismissiveness, a few German scientists and forward-thinking officers recognized the danger. They had developed their own radar systems, modest installations used primarily by the Kriegsmarine for naval operations. These engineers understood the fundamental principle. Electromagnetic waves could detect objects beyond visual range, creating an invisible shield of awareness. They warned that the British chain home system, despite its apparent crudeness, provided something the Luftwaffe lacked: advance warning. Minutes, sometimes tens of minutes, to scramble fighters, position anti-aircraft batteries, and coordinate defensive responses. The Luftwaffe command, dominated by career officers who trusted experience over innovation, buried these warnings beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference. The generals believed wars were won by men, not machines, by tactics refined through blood and iron, not by invisible waves bouncing through the atmosphere. The first cracks in German confidence appeared over southern England in the autumn of 1940. The Luftwaffe launched massive daylight raids intended to obliterate the Royal Air Force and pave the way for invasion. Yet every time German formations assembled over France and crossed the Channel, British fighters were already climbing to meet them, not scrambling desperately after the enemy appeared overhead, but positioned, waiting, ready. Luftwaffe pilots reported impossible response times. How could the British know exactly when and where they were coming? Some German crews suspected spies. Others thought the English possessed supernatural foresight. The truth was far more mundane and far more threatening. Chain-home radar stations tracked every German aircraft from the moment they left French airfields, feeding precise information to fighter command operations rooms, where young women pushed markers across plotting tables, creating a real-time picture of the battle unfolding overhead. September 15th, 1940, became the breaking point. Göring ordered what was meant to be the final crushing blow, wave after wave of bombers escorted by fighters. More than 500 aircraft committed to destroying the RAF once and for all. Berlin waited for news of victory. Instead, they received reports of catastrophic losses. British fighters intercepted the German formations with uncanny precision, striking at the most vulnerable moments, concentrating force where it would hurt most. The Luftwaffe lost 56 aircraft that day, crews that could not be easily replaced, machines that represented months of production. The British lost far fewer, and crucially, many of their downed pilots survived to fight again. The Battle of Britain was turning, and radar was the invisible hand guiding Britain's defense. Yet in Berlin, the generals still refused to acknowledge the truth. They blamed pilot error, poor tactics, bad weather, anything except the possibility that British technology had outmaneuvered German strategy. The Luftwaffe's dismissal of radar stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. German doctrine, forged in the rapid victories of Blitzkrieg, emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force concentrated at decisive points. These were principles of maneuver, of human decision-making, of commanders imposing their will on the battlefield. Radar represented something different: information dominance, the ability to see the entire battlefield simultaneously, to coordinate defensive responses with mechanical precision. The Luftwaffe High Command, steeped in traditional military thinking, could not grasp that warfare was evolving beyond their conceptual framework. They believed that superior training and aggressive tactics would always prevail. They failed to understand that no amount of courage could compensate for fighting blind against an enemy who could see. By 1943, the strategic situation had transformed completely. American bombers joined the air war, bringing unprecedented numbers and industrial capacity. The 8th Air Force launched massive daylight raids deep into Germany, targeting factories, refineries, and transportation networks. The Luftwaffe, now fighting a defensive war, finally began investing heavily in radar technology. They constructed the Kammhuber Line, an integrated air defense network stretching across occupied Europe, combining radar stations with night fighter units and searchlight batteries. For a time, it worked. German night fighters, guided by ground-based radar, inflicted terrible losses on RAF Bomber Command. But the technological race had already tilted decisively against them. The Allies, having pioneered operational radar use, were now developing electronic warfare, not just detecting enemy aircraft, but jamming enemy radar and communications. The Americans introduced Window. Clouds of aluminum strips dropped from bombers that created thousands of false radar returns, turning German screens into blizzards of meaningless noise. British scientists developed Mandrel and Jostle, powerful jammers that flooded German early warning radar with interference. Most devastatingly, the Americans deployed carpet jamming, specially modified B-24 Liberators bristling with antennas, broadcasting powerful static directly onto the frequencies used by Luftwaffe fighter control and pilot radios. The effect was catastrophic. German fighter pilots, trained to follow precise vectors from ground controllers, suddenly found themselves flying through a storm of electronic chaos. Their radios, once reliable lifelines, erupted with hissing waves of noise. Controllers shouted commands that never reached their pilots. Squadrons scattered, chasing phantom contacts, while real bomber formations pressed on toward their targets. Luftwaffe pilots described the experience as fighting underwater, drowning in invisible interference. One fighter ace later recalled hearing nothing but rushing waves in his headset, unable to determine where the enemy was or what his orders were. Ground controllers, watching their radar screens fill with false echoes, sent squadrons chasing shadows. Fighters arrived at intercept points to find empty sky, their fuel burning away while the real bomber streams struck elsewhere. The German command network, so carefully constructed, so dependent on radio communication and radar coordination, was being systematically blinded. The Luftwaffe had finally recognized the importance of radar, but their Allied opponents had already moved beyond mere detection. They were weaponizing the electromagnetic spectrum itself. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the tactical consequences. German pilots had always trusted their ground controllers, voices of calm authority guiding them through the chaos of aerial combat. When those voices disappeared into static, replaced by gibberish or eerie silence, trust evaporated. Pilots second-guessed every transmission, doubted every vector, wondered if the crackling voice in their headset was a genuine order or enemy deception. The Allies had developed ABC, airborne cigar. Operators who spoke fluent German and broadcast false commands on Luftwaffe frequencies, sending fighters to wrong altitudes or directing them away from bomber streams. The Germans never knew which transmissions to trust. Their entire system, built on coordination and centralized control, unraveled into individual aircraft hunting blindly through hostile skies. By late 1943 and into 1944, Luftwaffe losses spiraled beyond sustainability. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable veterans of years of combat, died not in heroic dogfights but in confused engagements where they never saw their killers. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training, stood no chance in the electromagnetic battlefield they didn't understand. German aircraft production actually increased in 1944, but there weren't enough trained pilots to fly them, and the coordination systems needed to employ them effectively had been comprehensively jammed. The Luftwaffe became a force of scattered individuals rather than a coordinated defense network. Meanwhile, Allied bombers struck with increasing impunity, their losses declining as German interception capabilities collapsed. The industrial dimension of the conflict revealed another layer of German miscalculation. Radar technology and electronic warfare required sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, specialized components, and continuous innovation. The Allies, particularly the Americans, possessed vast industrial resources and research establishments dedicated to electronics development. They could produce thousands of radar sets, hundreds of jamming aircraft, and constantly upgrade their systems to counter German countermeasures. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with dwindling resources, could not match this production. Their scientists understood the principles, but their factories couldn't build enough equipment quickly enough. The Luftwaffe's early dismissal of radar meant they entered the technological race years behind, and they never caught up. The transformation of air warfare was complete. What began as simple detection had evolved into comprehensive electromagnetic dominance. Allied aircraft carried identification transponders that allowed friendly radar to distinguish them from enemies. Bombers navigated using radar mapping, finding targets through clouds and darkness with precision. Fighter controllers directed intercepts with minute-by-minute updates. The entire Allied air effort functioned as an integrated system, each component connected and coordinated. The Luftwaffe, despite belatedly adopting radar, remained fragmented, blinded, and increasingly desperate. Their commanders, the same officers who had mocked British towers and dismissed American technology, now watched helplessly as their squadrons vanished from radar screens and never returned. Individual operations illustrated the totality of German defeat. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack on Allied airfields intended to destroy enemy aircraft on the ground. Nearly 1,000 German fighters participated, the largest operation they had mounted in years. Radar operators watched in horror as their own aircraft disappeared from screens in staggering numbers. Some fell to Allied fighters, others to friendly anti-aircraft fire because German gunners hadn't been informed of the operation. The coordination failures were complete. Without reliable communications, without effective radar coverage, without the electromagnetic infrastructure that modern air warfare demanded, the Luftwaffe achieved some tactical successes, but suffered irreplaceable losses. The operation accomplished nothing strategically while gutting Germany's remaining fighter strength. German radar operators and pilots recorded their shock in diaries and post-war interviews. They described watching formations simply vanish, entire squadrons erased from their screens without explanation. They spoke of the helplessness, the grinding realization that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't coordinate against. One radar technician wrote, "Today I watched the Luftwaffe commit suicide on my radar screen." Another pilot bitterly remarked that skill and courage meant nothing when you couldn't receive orders, couldn't find targets, couldn't even communicate with your wingman. The technology they had once mocked had become the decisive weapon of the war, and they had no defense against it. The climax came not in a single battle, but in the cumulative weight of hundreds of raids where German defenses simply failed. By spring 1945, Allied bombers flew over Germany in broad daylight, virtually unopposed. The Luftwaffe still possessed aircraft and pilots, but they could no longer function as an organized force. Their radar stations were bombed or jammed into uselessness. Their communication networks drowned in Allied electronic warfare. Their remaining fighters rose in small groups, attacking desperately and dying in large numbers. The sky over Germany, once defended by what had been the world's most formidable air force, belonged entirely to the Allies. The radar towers and jamming aircraft that German commanders had dismissed as primitive toys had orchestrated one of history's most complete military defeats. In the wreckage of defeat, German officers finally confronted what their arrogance had cost them. They had possessed capable scientists, access to radar principles, and early opportunities to develop comprehensive detection networks. They chose instead to trust in traditional methods and pilot skill and tactical aggression. They mocked what they didn't understand and dismissed warnings from those who did. One captured Luftwaffe general, reflecting in the aftermath, admitted bitterly that they had seen the British towers, known of the technology, but arrogance had silenced foresight. Another confessed that the German high command had been cocooned in confidence, refusing to believe that machines could alter the fundamental nature of warfare. May 1945 brought silence to the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of Nazi conquest, existed only as scattered remnants. Among the countless causes of German defeat, industrial capacity, strategic overextension, multiple fronts, the failure to recognize and counter Allied radar dominance stood as a particularly stark example of how technological blindness destroys military power. The Germans had laughed at radar, then adopted it too late, then watched helplessly as their enemies evolved beyond detection into comprehensive electronic warfare. The invisible weapon they had mocked became the invisible hand that swept them from the sky. The legacy extended far beyond World War II. Radar became fundamental to modern military operations, air traffic control, weather forecasting, and countless civilian applications. Every aircraft flying today does so within an invisible web of electromagnetic signals, detecting, communicating, navigating. The principles that British scientists pioneered and Allied forces weaponized transformed not just warfare, but civilization itself. The Luftwaffe commanders who dismissed those early towers as primitive couldn't imagine a future where the electromagnetic spectrum would be as contested as physical territory, where battles would be fought with signals and frequencies as much as with steel and explosives. There is a timeless lesson written in the Luftwaffe's defeat, one that transcends the specifics of radar technology or World War II. Arrogance blinds those who possess it. When confidence becomes contempt for new ideas, when success breeds dismissiveness toward innovation, and when established doctrine cannot accommodate changing reality, defeat becomes inevitable. The German commanders were not stupid or incompetent. They were experienced, battle-tested professionals who had won stunning victories. But they could not imagine that the rules of warfare might fundamentally change, that the next war might not resemble the last one, that invisible electromagnetic waves could matter as much as visible aircraft. Their mockery of radar reflected not ignorance, but something more dangerous, the certainty that they already knew everything they needed to know. History has repeated this pattern countless times in every field of human endeavor, whenever those in power dismissed challenges to their understanding as beneath consideration. If this kind of storytelling inspires you, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us what topic you'd like to see next. The sky that once trembled with the sound of battle now carries only peaceful contrails, and the constant invisible pulse of radar beams, a quiet reminder that the future belongs not to those who dismiss change, but to those who see it coming and adapt. The Luftwaffe vanished from those skies not because their pilots lacked courage or their aircraft lacked power, but because their commanders lacked the wisdom to respect what they did not yet understand.